My name is Anita Marin. I belong to the affiliates. And the affiliates is an umbrella organization that gives funds all over the campus. I wish we had thought of the parking thing where you park your car for $10 and go to the airport. That's a real moneymaker, and it's all for the students. Our lecture today is on democracy, our greatest export. And I have a few words to say about democracy. Aristotle said, democracy is best attained when all persons alike share in the government. That was in the 4th century. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, in the strict sense of the term, a true democracy has never existed and never will exist. To the Americans, Alexander Hamilton was afraid of the extremes of democracy. Abraham Lincoln said, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Woodrow Wilson said, the world must be safe for democracy, must be made safe for democracy. And somebody said, well, make the world safe for democracy ended by leaving democracy more unsafe in the world than at any other time. Somebody else said, you can only have democracy if the countries which must enjoy an economic surplus, at least appropriate, it's least appropriate for countries where there is an economic insufficiency. And then I was thinking as I looked at 60 Minutes this last Sunday, how the lobbyists are corrupting our democracy. I read the New York Times every day, and Paul Krugman said, we have a society in which money is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people, and in which that concentration of income and wealth threatens to make us a democracy in name only. Today's article by Thomas Friedman, short paragraph. Americans are protesting what is legal. A system of the Supreme Court sanctions bribery in the form of campaign donations that have enabled the financial service industry to effectively buy the U.S. Congress and both political parties, and thereby resist curbs on risk-taking. Democracy not only needs a decent ruling party, but an intelligent opposition. And so this is what we export, and Karen Kramer will tell you all about that. I'd like to formally introduce Professor Karen Kramer. Karen Kramer is a lecturer in political science at Purchase College. She currently teaches courses on the Middle East, politics, and economics, as well as courses in international relations, comparative politics, political economy, and democratization. A Middle East specialist, Professor Kramer previously served as executive editor of the Mideast Report, a publication on Middle East politics, economics, and business. She has published in leading scholarly journals and provides analysis on the Middle East for political risk consultancies, private sector clients, and research organizations. Her current research interests concern the dynamics of authoritarianism, democratic transition, and the relationship between economic and political liberalization. Please help me greet Professor Kramer.
Thank you all for coming here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. And a special thanks to the Purchase College affiliates for sponsoring this talk and for all the very, very fine and important work they do for the college. I'd like to talk to you today about the events that have been sweeping through the Arab world over the past year, events that were largely unforeseen, unprecedented, and which will play out in ways that are as yet unknown. Mass protests and upheaval have swept through the region, with regimes falling and others just barely hanging on. All Arab regimes faced increased pressure from their citizenry. That the political landscape of the Arab world has been irrevocably changed is clear. Less clear is what will take its place. Now, there are two big unknowns right now in the Arab world. One is which, if any, regimes will follow Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and fall. And secondly, what will transpire in the countries where there is transition? The answer to the first question is still unknown. Now that the regime in Libya has fallen and Gaddafi is dead, all eyes are on Syria. The regime of Bashar al-Assad is clearly deeply imperiled, although its willingness to resort to brutal repression and the ethnic and the sectarian cleavages in the country, which make many in Syria fear that regime collapse could trigger the kind of violent intercommunal conflict in the country that we've seen elsewhere, makes regime survival there a possibility. Indeed, we've yet to see in Syria the kind of critical mass in terms of millions of people coming out to protest that we saw in places like Egypt and Tunisia. Many among the minorities in Syria, the Christians, the Alawites, see the present regime as their best bet against a potentially repressive Sunni majority. And so far, the Sunni business and professional elite has not turned against the regime. However, if the Syrian economy continues to deteriorate, and it's certainly showing signs of tanking, a distinct possibility given increasing pressure of economic sanctions that are being imposed on the country by the international community, then more and more segments of the population may turn against the regime. Now, clearly, Yemen is another country that's on the knife's edge right now. Although the survival or even comeback potential of the wily President Saleh should not be dismissed out of hand. The crisis in that country has turned increasingly into a bloody confrontation between rival elites, each backed by segments of now divided security services, with the millions of peaceful protesters in Yemen who sought their own democratic revolution now caught in the crossfire. Now, with the economic and security situation in Yemen rapidly deteriorating, it is conceivable that Washington, as well as Saudi Arabia, the other long-term patron of Yemen, might acquiesce to a continued role for the authoritarian Saleh, especially if he offers up more anti-terrorist gifts to demonstrate his continued usefulness. So it's hard to make definitive calls at this point. We're observers on this front, a disquieting role for policymakers to be sure, particularly those in Washington who have profound strategic interests and allies in the region. Nevertheless, stability in the Arab world, so long taken for granted under authoritarian regimes who held on through a mixture of patronage and repression, is clearly now a thing of the past. Most of the Arab countries face the same toxic cocktail of problems: a legacy of poor economic stewardship, endemic corruption, unemployment levels that are unparalleled anywhere in the world, huge youth populations that have become increasingly aware, connected, and politicized, and repressive political orders that have silenced and humiliated their people for decades. And so these unfolding changes demand that we look beyond regime change and try to assess the nature of the transitions that are possible. Now, the hope of the protesters in the streets of the Arab world, and of many in the international community watching these events, is that a democratic transition will follow the breakdown of the brutal authoritarian order that has characterized the Arab world for many decades. How likely is this? And it's to this that I'd like to speak to you, emphasizing the difficulties, even though not impossibilities, of democratic transitions. Moreover, I would argue that democratic transitions will be particularly difficult in the case of the Arab countries, where the legacies are ones of political repression, dysfunctional or non-existent state institutions, a lack of the rule of law, divided populations and weak national cohesion, and the existence of strong, illiberal societal groups. Yes, democracy is possible in the Arab world. There is nothing inherently or permanently anti-democratic, I would argue, about any region or culture or religion. But it will be an uphill climb in the Arab world due to these legacies. And it will require the careful building of the conditions that are conducive to democratization. Democracies require a degree of national cohesion. They require effective leaders acting in the national interest. They require a functioning state with strong institutions that have the ability to administer effectively and neutrally to the country as a whole. They require a degree of societal consensus on the form of governance that can meet the core needs of the various constituencies. And they require, in the words of the renowned late Charles Tilley, trust. Trust that a democratically elected government can meet the needs of the various groups in society. And all of these things have been deeply undermined in the Arab world after decades of brutal repression and poor governance. The opposition in most of the Arab states today is badly fractured and divided. These divisions have been carefully nurtured by repressive regimes that ruled through tactics of divide and conquer, employing co-optation and repression selectively in order to divide groups and pit them against one another. The ability of groups to come together in the national interest, to forge a consensus, a shared vision on the fundamentals of a new order, and craft an inclusive government that is broadly responsive to the people, and able and willing to work in the national as opposed to the group interest, is as yet uncertain. But without these things, the buy-in, the compromise, the tolerance, so necessary for a functioning, meaningful democracy, is a tall order. Regimes throughout the Arab world have strengthened societal divisions. Authoritarian states that offered no political voice to their constituencies delivered little to their respective populations and brutally repressed major groups within their societies, did little to foster a sense of citizenship and a unified state identity. And as such, sub-state identities based on religious sect or ethnicity or clan, tribe, often remained strong. And the prevalence of identity politics, where citizens see themselves primarily as a member of a particular ethnic group or sectarian group or so forth, as opposed to a citizen of the state, undermine the kind of national cohesion democracies thrive on. Moreover, the strength of illiberal forces in society, and here in the Arab world, I refer principally to the Islamist parties, whose record so far in the Arab world has not been characterized by tolerance and compromise, also makes a successful democratic transition more difficult. These groups are often less amenable to compromise and less amenable to limitations on the state's role, which characterizes Western liberal democracy. I would argue that limitations on the state's role facilitate the ability of groups who have different visions of society to work together, since the state is a less intrusive presence in the lives of the citizens and allows a greater degree of individual choice in matters of spirituality and other realms that are seen in the Western context as properly belonging in the personal realm. Now, to a large extent, this is also a product of authoritarian rule. Islamist groups, who had the mosques and religious leaders were unintentionally the beneficiaries of authoritarian systems, gaining legitimacy and building support and institutional strength through their monopoly on opposition, since no other political voices were able to survive. And in post-authoritarian contexts, these types of groups are well placed to reap the advantages of electoral openings as they draw upon their organizational and institutional strengths that secular groups could never hope to amass in authoritarian contexts where political life was stamped out. So I would argue that the prevalence of identity politics and the prevalence of religious parties make a democratic transition just that much harder, as these groups tend to work against national cohesion and against the kind of tolerant, pluralistic order that democracies need. Now, can these things be overcome? Yes. But in part, that calls for exceptional leadership. And this too has been undermined by decades of authoritarian rule, during which the development of potential leaders was systematically thwarted by the state. Leaders with broad-based legitimacy and appeal, who can unify, cut across group lines, and put forth a national agenda and articulate a shared vision that all groups can subscribe to, are critical to a successful transition. And at this point, we have not seen the emergence of this kind of leadership in most of the Arab countries currently in turmoil. Let's take a look at some of the key countries, either in transition or who are potentially on the verge of it. In Egypt, there's real cause for concern, as the transition process has shown signs of faltering. The former president, Mubarak, may have been thrown out, but the military still effectively controls the country. Moreover, it has taken over shepherding the country through the transition process in an extremely untransparent way. Decisions are made with little or no input from society. Indeed, many have noted that the deep state, if you will, is still alive and well in Egypt. The former leader and his band of cronies may be gone, but the state's institutional strength, which came to pervade every aspect of Egyptian political and economic life, has so far survived largely untouched. The Military Council's agreement to hold early elections, giving in to a relatively limited extension, parliamentary elections are due shortly, has also created concern. This has reduced the ability of new political groups, most obviously the liberal forces that spearheaded the democratic protests in Egypt, to organize, mobilize, develop an agenda, and build support. Many have noted that these early elections in Egypt will inevitably favor the Muslim Brotherhood, the religious, political, and social movement that is considered the only well-organized group in the country, due to its long ability to develop its institutional strength through the mosques. Now, the Brotherhood has long rejected violence as a political tool and professes a commitment to democratic process, but this is not a liberal group. And the Brotherhood's record in other Arab countries has not been one of tolerance and compromise. The Brotherhood is also deeply divided between illiberal, conservative factions and more tolerant factions, making it harder to predict its post-electoral policies. Now, the ability of other groups to dominate the Egyptian political scene is doubtful. The young, liberal Facebook activists were able to pull only 20% of the vote in the referendum last summer on early elections, despite their pleas that such elections would not give them time enough to organize against the Brotherhood. And this does not suggest their ability to win a majority of votes. The Brotherhood's strength is estimated, no one knows for sure yet, but estimated at roughly 30%. There's also a small, but as yet unquantified Salafi constituency that refers to the very, very strict, rigid, intolerant Islamists. Much will depend on this anywhere from 30 to 50% unknowns in Egypt. These silent Egyptians who largely joined the protests to oust Mubarak, but whose political inclinations past that goal are as yet unknown. Most observers see this group as a deeply conservative constituency. They may have hated the daily humiliations and economic mismanagement of the Mubarak government, but they did not necessarily buy in to the calls for a liberal, secular, democratic Egypt that the Facebook activists championed. And I would argue that the Western media's focus on the latter group reflected a desired narrative more than an accurate reading of the Egyptian street. Indeed, many fear that this group could be easily won over by any party, religious or even quasi-authoritarian remnants of the old regime, who would offer populist policies that would seem, however erroneously, to provide some measure of economic relief to the long-suffering Egyptian masses. Now, the genie can't be put back in the bottle. The activists have made themselves a force to contend with in Egyptian politics, and they may yet be able to push the country towards a more democratic system. But deep reforms, constitutional reforms, electoral law reform, the establishment of a meaningful rule of law, guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of association, to name just a few, would all be required. And the pro-democracy activists' ability to push through such an agenda, given their inability to lengthen the time before elections, is as yet highly uncertain. Now, for states like Libya, where state institutions, to the extent that they ever existed, were completely hollowed out by a ruler who chose to rule through a brutal, personalistic order completely controlled by Gaddafi and his family, the building of state institutions from scratch that could administer effectively to the population and build the framework for a responsive, accountable, and pluralistic government that will administer to and serve and protect all groups equally, a requirement for a functioning democracy, will be a critical task. And this is a huge undertaking. Doable, but huge. Moreover, Libya faces a society deeply fractured by divisions. Regional divisions, for example, between east and the west of the country, tribal and sub-tribal divisions, divisions between exiles and those who stayed in the country during the long years of Gaddafi's rule, divisions between regionally based militias who want to see their payment in blood translated into political power, and divisions between Islamists and secularists. Now, the Transitional Council in Libya has done, by most accounts, an admirable job of trying to hold the country together and establish the groundwork for a successful transition. And indeed, one could also argue that the lack of existing state institutions in Libya actually saves Libya from the very difficult task of having to dismantle the deep state. Nevertheless, the Council's difficulties in bringing the regional militias under a national control and devising a way to satisfactorily allocate power and position among the various groups in the country is worrisome. The ability to construct an inclusive and broadly acceptable national government, now that Gaddafi is gone, will indeed be a difficult undertaking. Now, for states such as Yemen, that have a highly decentralized society, characterized by distinct tribal and regional areas and groups, each with their own institutional structures, controlling political and legal functions, a carefully crafted federalism would probably be required in any new democratic order. Now, it would have to be able to walk the line between a viable central government that effectively controls and administers national functions with a significant degree of autonomy for the disparate groups and regions in the country. But to get to this point, again, will be a tall order. The south of the country has become increasingly committed to secession, and the rivals currently circling President Saleh are seen by longtime Yemen watchers as little more than mafia heads who are primarily concerned with establishing their own power base and not with granting the masses who have come out in the streets in Sana'a a real political voice. Again, the potential for significant societal breakdown, if not even chaos or civil war, is real. Now, while there are political leaders in Yemen that are considered potentially effective leaders, their ability to gain national legitimacy in a society deeply fractured by these kinds of regional and sectarian and tribal divisions is an open question. Moreover, with Washington's concerns squarely focused on anti-terrorism, and Saudi Arabia concerned with little else than ensuring a stable, if weak and docile, Yemen, the willingness of outside players to push for a real democratic transition in the country is highly debatable. Syria is another hard call in terms of assessing prospects in the event of a regime change. While sporting a relatively educated and literate society and a sizable urban middle class, traditionally seen as conducive to a democratic transition, the country is marked, as I mentioned earlier, by deep sectarian and ethnic fissures. In fact, the fear in Syria itself of the kind of post-regime ethnic and sectarian warfare that turned Iraq into a bloodbath is one of the many things that may allow the regime to hold on to power. In any context, a semblance of law and order is better to many people than the kind of societal breakdown and violence and chaos that civil war brings. Moreover, decades of repression have rendered the opposition in Syria weak and fractured and leaderless. Opposition leaders in London are seen as having little internal legitimacy, and the lack of a broadly legitimate oppositional leaders would need to be overcome. And this is a tough feat in a country marked by ethnic and sectarian and ideological rifts. Now, to many observers, Tunisia represents the greatest potential for a democratic transition, and indeed the recent elections for a constituent assembly there, which were broadly seen as fair and open, with a remarkable 90% turnout, were an encouraging first step. Tunisia has a large educated middle class, and its population is relatively homogeneous, ethnically and religiously. The existence of a strong labor union movement in the country is also an advantage in the sense of providing an institutional basis and experience with societal mobilization. Now, not surprisingly, in the recent elections there, Ennahda, the moderate Tunisian Islamist party, won big, taking some 40% of the assembly seats, far exceeding that of any other political group. Ghannouchi, the head of Ennahda, has consistently called for an inclusive, tolerant, and pluralistic democratic order, and has pledged to rule in coalition with other parties. This is all extremely encouraging. Nevertheless, Ghannouchi is 70 years old. Ennahda has internal divisions between those who are more pluralistic and those who are less tolerant, and it's not clear the extent to which Ennahda will adhere to its liberal pledges after leadership passes from Ghannouchi. Now, while it's certainly possible that they will follow the path of Turkey's Islamist AKP party, under which Turkey has seen more progress towards democratization than under any previous secular government, the political trajectory of Tunisia will follow under an Islamist government is still, as of yet, unknown. Now, turning elsewhere, if we look at the Gulf monarchies, we see the effect of crushing, pretty much total crushing, of the protest movement in Bahrain, as conservative forces in the kingdom allied with Saudi forces to quell the protests with reluctant U.S. acquiescence, and little signs of unmanageable unrest in the other Gulf countries. So overall, the prospects for democratic transition in the Arab world are unclear at this point, and the implications of this analysis are important. if the lack of a successful transition ushers in a period of prolonged instability, or even a descent into civil war or chaos, this would have major strategic implications for the United States. It would negatively affect the maintenance of our strategic assets in the region, such as bases. It would further ratchet up the price of oil with obvious economic implications. It would disrupt our counterterrorism activities, which have depended on the cooperation of our regional allies. It would negatively affect our regional strategy to contain Iran, which has also depended upon cooperation with regional allies. And it would further complicate efforts to reach an Israeli-Palestinian accord. Clearly, a transition which avoids continued instability is not only a moral imperative for the people of the region, it's also a strategic imperative for the United States. A successful transition, on the other hand, to at least a somewhat more open and accountable government, even if not immediately a fully consolidated democracy, would bring long-term benefits. Many believe the stability thus produced could undercut the forces of radicalism in the region and allow the Arab countries to take their place among the productive nations of the world. Yet this outcome would undoubtedly require a recalibration of U.S. policies. The kind of close cooperation that many of our authoritarian Arab allies have afforded us in terms of counterterrorism cooperation, containment of Iran, affording military bases, policies toward Israel, these were regime-led. These were not policies that were popular with the Arab masses. And any more participatory and inclusive government that represents the will of the people is likely to be less forthcoming on some of these fronts. And in particular, popular resentment against Israeli policies and U.S. support thereof is likely to result in more significant pushback against U.S. policies regarding Israel than previously were accommodated by these regimes. You know, perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps this will precipitate a healthier, more balanced relationship between Washington and all of the Middle East countries. Indeed, the maintenance of good relations with countries such as Turkey and India and Brazil, countries who do not always see eye to eye with Washington, and who are able to push back when they see their national interests diverge from ours, has shown that good relations are not necessarily dependent upon blind subservience. Moreover, the relative lack of any anti-US nature in the unrest sweeping the Arab world, especially given the fact that Washington supported these authoritarian allies for decades, speaks to the potential for the continuance of good relations with the Arab countries. A successful transition to democracy in the Arab world is going to take time, a great deal of time. Hopes that this so-called Arab Spring would quickly usher in a democratic order throughout the countries of the Arab world, I would argue, put an unfair burden on the brave activists that have been calling for democracy. It should be remembered that the transition to democracy in the West took many centuries. That the political landscape of the Arab world has been changed irrevocably is indisputable. But the process of democratic transition will likely be far slower and more difficult, I believe, than many hoped. It is my hope that perhaps we're seeing the very beginnings of such a transition, the first step, the seeds, if you will, planted, that will perhaps one day bring forth the kind of accountable, effective, and democratic government that this region deserves. Thank you. Open it up to questions? Certainly.
Yeah. Karen, can I hand out my remarks that I had typed up?
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I was wondering what influence, if any, that the elephant in the room, that is Iran, might have in terms of impeding democratic evolution in the countries you talked about so
Well,
well?
I would actually flip that question backwards, if you would allow me. To answer specifically your question, Iran has had little influence, and increasingly so, in terms of the protest movements throughout the Arab world. And in fact, most analysts of the region concur that Iran has lost a great deal of street credibility, given that it brutally repressed its own protest movement, and now here the Arab world is rising up and kind of showing them how to do it, if you will. So the model of more accountable governance elsewhere really is, I think, undermines Iranian influence in the region and has set them back in terms of their hopes of being a model and having influence and having, you know, street credibility, if you will. I think they've lost a great deal of it.
Thank you.
Yes.
It seems to me that at the basis of all these countries, what you need for democratization is compromise between differing parties. And it also seems to me in the United States, which is supposed to be a democracy, we no longer have the ability to compromise coming from either of the extremists on the left or the right. And I'm wondering if our democracy is really at risk now.
No, that's a good question. Are you asking me if I think it's at risk, or?
Well, I mean, I don't see compromise in anything. Now the
Well,
Super Six.
I would agree that the United States right now is in a state of frightening political dysfunction, as is Europe. You know, our problems are not so much economic. While they are severe, most would argue that they are, could be addressed if the political will existed. What is more frightening, I think, is this very serious signs of political dysfunction and political paralysis in the country, yes. So I agree with that. I'm not sure. Is there another question hidden in there? Or?
Well, I think another manifestation, not only in the United States, but in almost all the countries with the masses of people are rebelling in the streets. Not necessarily violently, but you see it in Britain, you see it in Italy, you see it in Greece, you see it in the Wall Street movement, the anti-Wall Street debate in Wall Street, in multiple cities in the United States.
Well, that's one of the beautiful things about democracy. I think at one point you said, is it imperiled in the West? I think, well, I have an easy answer to that, no. I don't think it is. That said, I acknowledge the grave political dysfunction and paralysis that I just spoke to, but I think one of the enduring qualities and indeed the strength of Western liberal democracy is its strength to self-critique, renew, and sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes it takes a frightening long time, but to rejuvenate itself and transform itself. Which we have seen through many crises in the West. And I would certainly hope and expect that to be the case in the present context. Yes, you had a question. Right behind you. Yes, in the blue. Yes, you're who? No, the gentleman right next to you. Is that a student?
You're pointing off
Yeah.
to that direction, so you don't want to be arrested.
Yes, you.
I was wondering, when you brought up...
You can be next.
When you brought up how democratization in the West took hundreds of years, I was wondering if maybe similar circumstances might also reproduce better results during the time when the West was democratizing. Groups that were pushing usually had an enemy to rally against. In America, we had the British Empire. When the French Revolution took place, instituting the First French Republic, the French people basically had to rally against all the rest of monarchist Europe. When the Russian Revolution took place, the Bolsheviks generally used the capitalists, and before them, the moderates under Kerensky continued to wage their war against Germany.
So is there a question in there?
So let's get to your question.
Basically, can an outside enemy spur the groups within a particular country to rally together and unite for the sake of defending their country and create that kind of national cohesion?
No, I don't think the threat of a foreign aggressor or the foreign enemy is the critical, is the linchpin of it. No, and in fact, authoritarian rule in the Arab context has long been, well, it's been sustained by many things, but one of the things it's been sustained by was governments who constantly pointed to the threat of foreign aggressors, be they the West, or be they Israel, or be they the Persians, or some other aggressor, that legitimized and rationalized their repression as a necessary act in order to safeguard the nation from those who would seek to weaken it. So I think, if anything, more often, at least certainly in the Middle Eastern context, the use of a foreign aggressor has impeded democratization. Sorry, you had.
Do you have any insights into how the Israeli government and its upper level leaders are viewing these different movements, and whether there's been any backroom attempt to reach out to any of the forces that have stimulated these revolutions in order to create dialogue?
I have no inside information with the Israeli government. I can tell you that the consensus is that Israel, and this is borne out by what their actions, they appear, as many of us all around the world, to have been caught off guard by these developments. They don't know what to do about it. They are very nervous about it for good reason, and for the reasons that I mentioned, that the Arab street is not going to be amenable to the kind of accommodation with Israel that many of the U.S.'s authoritarian allies were willing to provide, so that they recognize that there's going to be a tilt away from that. What they're going to do about it, I don't know. At this point, they seem to be doing little about it, and sitting and waiting and hoping, and certainly I would be very surprised were they to be reaching out to some of these groups, and I think that they are hoping for, as much as possible, a maintenance of the status quo, which they benefited from. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation, because sometimes you don't receive that in the news, you know. But I really had a question about the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes.
And their influence throughout the world. In other words, were they infiltrated in Egypt, and now that they want to get the stronghold there, and then they go into Europe, and then i.e. come into the United States?
Well, I think you give them a little more credit than...
I mean, no, sometimes you hear stories like that, so you...
Okay, well, the Muslim Brotherhood is the largest organized Islamist group in the Arab world, and the Muslim Brotherhood actually has arms in many different countries. It's not always called the Muslim Brotherhood. For example, Hamas is the Palestinian arm of the Brotherhood. Islamic Action Front in Jordan is the Jordanian arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we see these in many different Arab contexts. It is a very large, its birthplace was Egypt in 1928. But it has spread, and it is quite a large organization. I don't see them moving into the West, but they are a very viable and organized and coherent and strong force in the Arab world. That said, they are going through their own crisis right now. Oh. They are deeply riven by conflict and rifts within the group itself as to how do we navigate this new world that we're seeing, and how do we position ourselves in terms of this calls for pluralistic democratic government, and can we work in that kind of a framework? And some arguing, yes, not only can we, but we should and we must. Others saying, no, this is a betrayal of our original commitment to Islamic principles that should not be subject to electoral whim and democratic policies. So, and we've even seen splintering of the Brotherhood to the point where certain groups have broke off from the Brotherhood and formed their own groups. So they are having their own crisis, and yet to be seen how that will play out.
And their influence coming into the United States, I had heard that be the case.
I don't think they have an enormous amount of influence in the United States. Yeah. Do I have any yes?
Do you think that there's a relationship between the indigenous democratic movement of the Arab Spring and like democracy imposed externally in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States?
No, I don't see that there. I don't see the connection, and many have asked that question, and some have posited that. And no, I think if anything, the externally imposed regime change, ostensibly for democratization, although originally that was not the aim. That just became, it morphed into democratization, but that was not the initial goal of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I think that if anything, the experience of that, enforced regime change and democratically imposed government set back the forces of democratization in the Arab world. And indeed, this is a big player in Syria right now, because the Syrians, the regime of the Assad regime in Syria is not a loved regime. The Syrians really despise the regime. Yet they have not en masse turned against it. Why? Iraq is probably one of the biggest answers. They look at what happened in Iraq and they think, my God, we don't want that here. Who would want that? I mean, it was a literal bloodbath. And the Iraqis paid a very, very dear price for that. And I think that that engendered great fear in other societies and facilitated regimes' ability to say, well, if you don't want that, stick with me. I think that, if anything, it's remarkable that the indigenous protests were able to, form and percolate up and gather steam in the face of not only the danger of going up against their own brutal, repressive authoritarian orders, but also seeing what had happened in Iraq. So I don't see there as a connection there, other than the fact that, if anything, it has strengthened the hand of authoritarian rulers that could point to that. Do you have any students here? Yes?
Can you elaborate a bit about your remarks about Turkey and whether you think it may begin to influence what's happening in the other Middle East?
They hope to influence it. They've been very, very active. They increasingly see themselves as a regional force and indeed model, both politically in terms of being able to push forward the model of a secular democratic government that is nonetheless ruled by I hesitate using the word Islamist because the AKP has accepted the validity of secular rule. But the leaders themselves would call themselves Islamists, okay? They see that being able to put forth that as a model would be a tremendous boon for the Arab world, and I think they wish to do that, but they also need to tread lightly. They don't want to be seen as imposing, they don't want to be seen as arrogant. There still is kind of that little tiny leftover lingering bad taste in the mouth of the Ottoman period when the Turks ruled the Arab lands, and they have to be careful with that and tread carefully. They also have the potential, I would argue, to be a very, very viable economic model for the Arab world mired in inefficient, unproductive, state-dominated economies, and Turkey showing that you can be an open, market-based, capitalist country, export-led, so on and so on, private sector-dominated, and thrive under this model. I think that that could, and I'm hoping that that will be a model that will be pushed forward to the Arab world, because I think the economic piece of this is critical. And I think that this is often not looked at closely enough in terms of gauging these Arab transitions. Everybody's looking at the political piece of it. But if the economic grievances aren't addressed, and the economic grievances and problems in the Arab world are severe, then the potential for as I mentioned in my talk, for groups to kind of rally behind some kind of populist leader that's going to just be able to throw some kind of economic relief at them, which will not really systemically restructure these economies in a more productive way, is going to be that much more, likely. But Turkey is doing that. Sometimes they've been slapped down. When they said, I forget which Turkish leader, it was the foreign minister, one of them, went to visit Egypt and talked about this model of secular democratic government. They were met with fury. Who are you to tell us how to run our stuff? And we are Muslims, and we're going to do it our way, and thank you very much, mind your own business. So they were slapped down very quickly. So do they wish to be a model? Yes. Can they be? Yes. Are they trying to be? Yes, but treading carefully. And it takes receptiveness on the other side, a receptiveness to say, yes, this is something that might be able to work, and let's see how you did it. I don't know the extent to which that receptivity exists on the Arab side. I hope it does, because Turkey has been a remarkable success story on many different levels, both political and economic. Yes?
I wonder whether you see any hope at all for a settlement of the dispute over land with the Israelis. It's the flashpoint in all of this.
Not in my lifetime. I don't know if you want me to expand on that, or, I mean, the short answer to your question is no, I don't see it as of yet. Sadly.
And there's no hope, really, what you're saying.
Well, I mean, eventually, we all know, everyone knows the broad outlines of the agreement that must be, and if it ever is reached, will eventually be reached. It's going to take the two parties getting to the point where the price of the conflict is greater than the price of the compromises that they have to make. And until both sides make that calculation, you're going to see a willingness to continue the conflict. I mean, why did the steam come out in Northern Ireland? Because the people eventually said, enough. We are not going to support leaders who want to continue the conflict. We need to make a settlement and take what we can, and work with that, because the price is too high. Until you get a point where the populations broadly believe that the price is too high, you are unlikely to see movement. Now, I don't see that calculation being made at this point. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I do see it in my lifetime. But I don't see it as of yet.
But can anything else get done while that's an obstruction?
I'm sorry, sir?
Can anything else get accomplished until that particular thing at the center of the whole dispute is...
Yes, I do think much can and should be accomplished. I don't think the Middle East can be crunched down, the totality of it, to the Arab-Israeli conflict. There are many issues, and I think indeed this is what authoritarian rulers in the Arab world have said for decades. It's all about that. It's because of that. It's because of Israel. It's because of the Zionists. This conflict is what's bleeding the region. This conflict has been incredibly costly in the deepest sense of the word. But it doesn't mean that many of these other problems wouldn't exist and continue, and regional rivalries between Arab governments in Iran, between all these other issues would not be there, or if the Arab-Israeli conflict were solved, that these other issues would go away. They would not. I mean, the Saudi-Iranian Cold War at this point, which is really, really cold, okay, deep freeze. I mean, that is not contingent in any way upon either a continuance or the settlement of an Arab-Israeli conflict. So I think that we tend to view it through the prism of that, because the United States is very focused on that conflict, but there is much that goes on in the Middle East that is, independent of that. Another question? Yes, in the back. Yes.
Just wondering, how big a role do you think international institutions that are mostly run by the U.S., like the UN, NATO, and stuff like that, will have? What role do you think they'll have in the progression of these reforming governments in terms of on the economic standpoint, politically, cooperating with the international community and stuff like that? Do you think that the international community will have a big role in possibly leading them more towards democratization, placing sanctions and stuff like that, when they feel like these new reforming governments are doing things that you feel like they'll give them guidelines or?
Well, it depends on what issue that you're talking about. In terms of democratization, no, I would argue that it has to come from within. It has to be indigenous. That said, that doesn't mean that an international environment can be either more conducive or less conducive to facilitating the transition. I mean, if we look at this great story of Eastern and Central European transition to democracy, and relatively speaking, the success that was. Well, one of the pieces underpinning that success was that you had a Western world that said, yes, come in, and we want you, we need you, and we will help you. We will underwrite you financially. We will give you the kind of political and security and economic support that you need to facilitate this transition. Now, the West said that because it had a strategic imperative in making sure that Eastern and Central Europe at that time didn't go back to, the Soviet Union or later Russia. We were still nervous. We were still kind of swallowing this whole notion of, wow, the Cold War is over and we won. Look at that. So there was a tremendous embrace on the part of Eastern and Central Europe. I think that was, historically speaking, an anomaly. I think there was a unique strategic imperative there and dynamic there that made the rich, powerful world do everything it can to facilitate that transition. In the Arab world, you have a much more ambivalent international climate. You have particularly with the powers that lead, the United States, you have countries, but also European countries as well, countries that have authoritarian Arab allies. You have countries that are very focused on counterterrorism, that think, well, you know what? What's our best bet in being able to focus on this and achieve this objective? So you have conflicting objectives, and so therefore you have some ambivalence as to a democratic transition, because the fear is that, well, will whatever take its place, in other words, take the place of the authoritarian regime, be less amenable to working with us on these other strategic issues? So that ambivalence creates, I think, a more tepid international response. I mean, ideally, if the international community would be able to step forward and say, we will give you the kind of assistance you need, we'll give you the technical assistance, we'll give you the political assistance, we'll give you economic assistance, we'll give you the we'll help fund a safety net, a security blanket, if you will, while we help you to transform your economies. Were the West to do that, I think it would be important. It would be significant. But I think part of it is that there is more ambivalence on the part of the international community. But I think all of that said, at the end of the day, it still has to happen internally. If the will is there internally, then can the international community facilitate? Yes, it can. If the will is not there internally, the international community cannot impose. The IMF has stepped forward with countries like Egypt and others to say, can we help finance some of the difficulties of the transition here? And, to some extent, there's been a little bit of pulling back from the Arab world, who still sees the IMF as kind of Western powers that don't necessarily have the Arab countries' best interests in mind, but rather just want to expand this globalized order that the Western world will inevitably be the main beneficiaries of. There's still a mistrust of that. So there's ambivalence on that end too. So I think it could play more of a role than it has been playing. But then again, there's always the exception that breaks the rule. Look at Libya, that wouldn't have happened without international assistance. That was a pretty surprising development that the international community stepped forward. And I think to some extent that's a product of the anomaly of who Gaddafi was, where he basically was this hated figure that nobody liked. He didn't have friends anywhere, and it wasn't that important a country. There was many factors that facilitated the international community's willingness to step forward there. So it's a kind of a mixed bag answer. I'm sorry, I can't give you, Other questions? Yes.
Could Malaysia stand as a model for Islamic State, but secular freedoms and capitalism, thriving capitalism?
often people point to the model of Southeast Asian Islam and Southwestern Islam as a kind of could this be a template that would help facilitate marrying Islamic culture with democratic governments in the Arab world? The easy answer, yes, it could be, possibly. Has it been so far? Not particularly. Asian Islam is rooted in different cultural traditions, and it is quite different than Islam in the Arab world at this point in time. But nothing is fixed. Everything is evolving, and could that end up being a model? Yes. I think Turkey has more potential for being a model than a country like Malaysia. Yes.
Now, with us leaving Iraq so abruptly, I feel like.
Abruptly?
Well, not abruptly. I feel like it's been like slowly we've been leaving Iraq, and then also more getting all the troops out. How's that going to affect the Iraqi country? Like, will democracy still stand, or?
Well, your assumption your question is assuming that democracy is standing now and will survive. And I would question that. I think that the Iraqi, I think Iraq, at least to my mind, and many would agree with me, has been a heartbreaking disappointment, particularly given the price that was paid all around. I would not call that country a functioning democracy. Not that they haven't had free and open and fair elections, they've had, but a democracy is so much more than elections. Yeah, it is not a functioning, effective state, administering neutrally and effectively to all of the different groups in the country. It's just not there yet. It's not anywhere near there. And I don't think it will be under the present government. I think that the government there that we are leaving behind is, let me just put it kindly, deeply flawed. Okay, and so the future of it, I see two possible futures, near to medium term. Long term, who knows, okay? But near to medium term, either they're going to kind of muddle along as is, because everyone is so tired in Iraq and so wrung out by the terrible events that happened there. They could just muddle along in this very, unsatisfactory, dysfunctional state for some time, or it could deteriorate. And I have worries about that. There are very, very deep, unresolved conflicts between the Kurds and the Arabs, which everyone has always focused on this Shia-Sunni division because that's where the real blood was shed. But that doesn't mean that the conflict between the Kurds and the Arabs is any less potentially explosive or irreconcilable, because it is. It's quite serious. As well as the fact that the Shia government in Iraq still has yet to come to terms with the fact that any effective national government is going to have to reach out to the Sunni community and lead as a national government. They have not done that. No matter how hated, no matter how many horrible things the Sunni government did to them, which they did under Saddam Hussein and previous Sunni governments, do the Shia have their legitimate grievances? Absolutely. But when we look at successful transitions in other countries, in other historical or regional contexts, if you look at South Africa, you look at other countries, you can see you see that the new order has to deal quite charitably and generously with the old order. A vengeful, vindictive, punitive government is likely to produce exactly what it produced in Iraq. The old order says, we have no interest in buying into this. We have nothing to lose by trying to push back against this because there's nothing here for us. So I think that the possibility of an uptick in conflict is certainly there, or muddling along in the same, pretty lousy state. I don't see things markedly improving. Long term, possibly, the Iraqi people, there's tremendous strength there. But I think that's a long-term proposition.
Thank you.
Yes?
Would you comment on your own travels in any of these areas? You've obviously specialized in, you have a strong interest in what's going on in these areas. How much travel, where your insights come from?
I'm sorry, sir, can I hold 1 second? We're at time. Are there any students here, any of my students that had questions? I'm so sorry, because I did want to get to them, the students here. No? Okay, I'm so sorry to cut you off, because I see we're at time. Yeah.
I'm interested in your travels to these areas. I know you have maintained contacts with leadership and,
My contacts have been varied, governmental contacts, business contacts, research organization, a lot of journalists. There are a lot of fine journalists working in the region who are doing superb work. I don't know if you read Anthony Shadid in the New York Times. He is a superb reporter, very accurate, very careful. He can be, relied upon. So there's also a number of groups that are doing terrific work in the region. The International Crisis Group, I don't know if you're all aware of that. They have a website. They do wonderful analytical studies and reports, very in-depth analysis with analysts all over the place. So, other research organizations and think tanks. So, broad range of different kinds of contacts. I mean, and that's really what it takes. You need to be able to get at all different layers because different pieces get different slices of the picture and the information. Any other questions? Yes?
The four nations that we talked about in the Arab Spring, without putting you too much on the spot, do many of them have compulsory education? Do they have middle class? How much oil and what is the population? What are we talking about?
Let me get my encyclopedia. Yes. Next. Yes. As we said, Tunisia has a sizable middle class. And indeed, that many argue that that has been one of the pieces that has helped them along. But there is a sizable middle class in Algeria, in Egypt, in Syria. It also has a sizable middle class. Is there compulsory education? Yes, there's, education through, up to the college level. That said, the quality of the education is often quite poor. And of course, the educational level and literacy rate among women is quite poor. And it's interesting. One of the most significant criteria for successful development in a country, which has been shown to be statistically significant over and over and over again, is the literacy and education of the women. Because when the women go to school and the women are literate, they make the children go to school. And when the children go to school, you have the development of your human capital. And at the end of the day, what's going to underpin your economic success? It's your human capital. Are your people educated? Are they healthy? So on and so on. So there's a lot of work there to be done. A lot of work there to be done. Anita, do we?
Okay. Thank you very much.